actually look at this we're just going to be recording right there. Can the dead actually hear the living people? In other words, when I go to the grave and I say, Assalamu alaikum dara qawm al-mu'mineen, right? Regardless of the differences of opinions, can women visit grave? All these different things. Okay. Now, that's the thing, is that when you actually go and visit the grave, you will actually see that it's actually the sunnah to say something like, Assalamu alaikum dara qawm al-mu'mineen. So the debate actually takes place between a number of different scholars, and the debate was not only between scholars, but between the Sahaba as well. So you had, for example, some of the Sahaba that said that no, it's impossible for the dead to hear us, even if we were to pass by the grave, like Sayyidah Aisha, Abdullah ibn Abbas, Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, and that was actually the majority of scholars. And from them, like a lot of the Hanafi scholars, Ibn Abdin, Ibn al-Humam, Ibn Nujaym, and a number of different Maliki scholars, al-Maziri, al-Baji, a number of different different scholars, even from the modern scholars like Al-Albani, and so they said they can't hear us. And the reason why they said they can't hear us, well, they said, وَمَا أَنْتَ بِمُسْمَعٍ مَنْ فِي الْقُبُورِ. They said, here it is, the ayah is clearly saying, literally saying, and you won't be able to allow the people that are in the grave actually hear you. And in another hadith, إِنَّكَ لَا تُسْمِعُ الْمَوْتَى. You're not capable of making the dead people actually hear. And of course, that comes in, where is this actually talking about? Is this actually talking about the real dead people, in the real people in the grave, that they can't actually hear this? Or is this actually talking about a metaphor? In other words, that the person that is dead, you're not going to be able to have them hear you. إِنَّكَ لَا تُسْمِعُ الْمَوْتَى. This is not actually talking about a real and an active,
Hello, Sora, Dr. Vanessa.
A real dead person, but this is talking about that a person that is so blinded, in other words, so locked up in their own cells, that they're just like dead, and that it's only the Quran, it's only Hidayah, it's only the guidance that actually is capable of bringing them life. All right. And same thing here. وَمَا أَنْتَ بِمُسْمِعٍ مَنْ فِي الْقُبُورِ. That, oh, you are not going to be able to actually bring sound. This is not literally, according to those scholars, that this is not literally speaking about, you're not going to be able to have the people in the graves hear you, but this is actually speaking about a metaphor, that they're just like as if they were in the graves, where they can't even hear the living words. And in other words, it's basically saying, if you can't hear the living words, to also mean that the words of the Quran, the words of Hidayah, are really what bring in life. And a person that's away from Hidayah is basically dead in that sense. Or at least they would be as if they are basically dead. Now, here's the thing, is that when we're looking at these evidences, it's not just one evidence, but there's a very important hadith that stands out, and which actually is called the hadith Qalib Badr. Qalib Badr basically means the well of Badr. What is the story? So the story was that the Prophet ﷺ actually stood on one of the empty wells. Basically, there was no water in it, and there were a lot of the people that were killed from the people of Quraysh that basically were collected. In other words, they were brought up, accumulated, and actually, instead of open up a grave for them, they were just thrown within that well. So the Prophet ﷺ actually says and talks to them and says, هل وجدتم ما وعد ربكم حقا? Did you find what your Lord Almighty had promised you is true? And then he said, إنهم الآن يسمعون ما أقول. Now they're hearing, and they're capable of hearing what I'm saying. Now, when Sayyidah Aisha was actually told that, she said, well, there's that sentence within it, إنهم الآن, that يعلمون أن الذي كنت أقول لهم هو الحق. So she said, well, what he meant was that now they're capable of hearing what I was telling them about the afterlife is basically true. So it's not that they're hearing him right now. So again, this is that debate. There is another hadith, and of course, Umar ibn al-Khattab did question the Prophet ﷺ. He said, "Well, they're dead," but then the Prophet ﷺ tells him that no, they're actually hearing me. So was that an exception for the Prophet ﷺ, or does that include everyone else? So when we have a dead person in front of us, dead loved one, and then we're talking to them, do they actually hear what we're saying? How does this actually happen? Or do they basically just, they just die and all their organs die and don't function anymore? Or is it anyways the organ when a person is dead, is it really the organs that hear things? Or is this, yes, they are in the world of barzakh, and right now, our relationship with the dead person is not through their body, but through the souls? Or is that the case? So again, there's so many different evidences. I'm just going through the evidences really quick, and just to see it. In where even there's a hadith where inna lillahi malaikatan sayyahina fil ard yuballighunani an ummati salam. The Prophet ﷺ actually said that there are malaika that would be touring around on earth. They would just come to the Prophet ﷺ saying, well, that person said, Allahumma salli ala Muhammad. They are actually, they're just there to just collect the salams and actually tell the Prophet ﷺ. So, but here's the thing, is that many scholars, when they responded and refuted those evidences, they said that those were actually exclusive to the Prophet ﷺ and not everyone else. So this is an exclusive situation and not to everyone else. So if, for example, I'm right there saying, oh ya Rabbi, Allahumma salli ala my uncle, or etc., or my relative, and deliver my salams to them, and does that actually get to them? So again, when you make the dua, it's a different story. And that's why the Prophet ﷺ said, إِذَا مَاتَ ابْنُ آدَمَ قَطَعَ عَمَلُهُ إِلَّا مِنْ ثَلَاثٍ. If the son of Adam dies, their actions are actually disconnected. They're ended by their death. In other words, their actions are terminated from getting an increase or a decrease, except from three things. And amongst that, he said, وَلَدٌ صَالِحٌ يَدْعُو لَهُ, a pious son that is making an invocation for them, asking Allah Almighty for forgiveness, etc. Now, here's the thing, is that, there's that debate where the other scholars said, to actually make a dua for somebody, it doesn't necessarily mean you're talking to them. So they said, well, wait a minute, let's talk about talking to somebody. How come when we go to the graveyard, the sunnah is to actually say, Assalamu alaikum dara qawmin mu'mineen. Assalamu alaikum, the chamber or the house of the believers. Even if a person would actually go to a non-Muslim graveyard or a non-Muslim cemetery, the sunnah is to actually tell them, have you found what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has promised you, or to actually tell them about the hellfire. So is this really talking to them at all? So that's again the debate, where was this really you talking to yourself and you recognizing that moment? So you're saying, Assalamu alaikum dara qawmin mu'mineen. Assalamu alaikum. Is this really you taking in that recognition to say it, that, hey, I'm entering, they're actually there, etc.? Or is this really you saying Assalamu alaikum, including you, including the malaika, etc., and you're taking that moment? Who really are you talking to? So the other scholars that said that this was all impossible for any dead person to hear the living person, they said this is actually you making a dua for yourself. It's a form of dhikr. It's a form of reminder for you to recognize the situation that you're in, and therefore to take in that speech directed at them, but technically it's actually regarding, and it is actually reward going towards yourself, a moment of recognition, a moment of dhikr, and a moment for reviving your faith. All right. So what about these ayat? For the scholars that said that it is possible for them to hear us, they actually said we can't go to any metaphorical meaning or metaphorical interpretation if we can interpret any word literally. If we can use the literal format is enough and is supposed to be an evidence to prove that something is possible. And that's where, of course, this is a very huge debate even between scholars. So when do we actually go and claim that this verse is actually metaphorical or whether this is literal? All right, this is a very huge debate. And when you talk about something metaphorical, you're actually saying, if you cannot interpret something literally, that's the only time that you actually go for a metaphorical interpretation. But you don't abandon the literal sense of it, the literal meaning of it, the literal interpretation of it by just simply saying, well, because it's impossible, it's not something that by context. In other words, we're not going to take the literal meaning. We're going to go for the metaphorical meaning or metaphorical interpretation. So again, a huge debate, just to keep a note of that. So even with this now, it's really important, to actually mention when you look at, for example, one of the hadith where the Prophet ﷺ, and this hadith is actually in Sahih Muslim. So what does the hadith actually say? إن العبد إذا وضع في قبره وتولى عنه أصحابه إنه لا يسمع قرع نعالهم. That when the person is actually put in the grave, وتولى عنه أصحابه, and his friends, they basically move on. They basically depart the graveyard, the cemetery. It said he would actually be capable of hearing even the stomping of their shoes over his grave. And this is just just some of those evidences. In fact, Umar Sulaiman al-Ashqar, not Umar Sulaiman, the famous speaker, right? But he actually said that this was thabata. It was like this was evident. There were many hadith that are actually authentic, that actually say of that. In fact, even when Umar ibn al-Khattab responded to the Prophet ﷺ about the hadith that we said earlier, the Prophet ﷺ talking to Umayyah ibn Khalaf, talking to ibn Utbah ibn Rabi'a, Shayba ibn Rabi'a, Abu Jahl, and he was telling them, أليس قد وجدتم ما وعدكم ربكم حقا? Did you not find what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had promised you as true? But Umar ibn Khattab, he said, كيف يسمعون? How are they going to hear us? He said, أَنَّا يُجِيبُوا وَقَدْ جَيَّفُوا. He said, how are they going to respond when they had already started decomposing? In other words, they're right now really dead. So the Prophet ﷺ actually said, وَالَّذِي نَفْسِي بِيَدِهِ مَا أَنْتَ بِأَسْمَعَ لِمَا أَقُولُ مِنْهُمْ. By the one that has my soul in his hand, you cannot hear me more than what they can hear. ولكنهم لا يقدرون أن يجيبوا. But they're not capable of responding. And then basically that hadith is actually in Sahih al-Bukhari. Now, and this is actually the opinion of Ibn Jarir al-Tabari, Ibn Qutayba, and a number of different scholars. So what I want to say is what's more important than can they actually hear us or not hear us is really when we have differences of opinions between scholars, and I mean valid scholars. I'm not talking about somebody that is trying to somehow work with a certain agenda. I'm talking about valid scholars, all right, qualified scholars. That in that situation, even if your sheikh says otherwise, if you know that there are scholars and valid scholars in scholars that actually had the fiqh, had the ilm, had, even if they come from a different madhab, all you could do is just accept the fact that this is a matter of differences of opinion, and that before you rush to condescend a brother or a sister or a group for saying a different opinion, I'm just saying, embrace the unity before you rush, embrace the unity of the ummah before you rush and be so fanatic about one particular opinion and actually cause a disunity within the ummah. This is extremely important to always remember. So, because you even have other scholars like Al-Munawi from the Hanafi madhab, who actually said, we can even combine these ahadith in where they could be in the beginning capable of hearing, and later on they would lose their capacity of hearing, because anyways, when a person dies, we do see that, in scans and stuff, that their body, they're considered clinically dead, but we do see that there's some gray matter that still is there, and it takes a couple minutes until it finally dies off. They are considered dead, but we do see that it's going to take some while until it becomes fully dead. So what really happens in the end is that, this is a matter of differences of opinion. And just like when we talk about whether we're talking about hearing the dead, can the dead hear us, or whether we're talking about things like the differences of opinions on different matters, before rushing to, attack, calm down. Islam is a big, vast ilm. It's a big, vast ilm. Absorb the unity of the ummah before you jump into attacking, especially if there are valid opinions. And alhamdulillah. All right. So in the end, just wanted to say this one, just wanted to say that one, because, it's subhanAllah, it becomes a very common issue where, sisters would hear one scholar probably considering one matter as preponderant, and then they would rush in denouncing every other opinion. It's really dangerous, because that's what's actually bringing in all those scars within the ummah and all those divisions within the ummah. Just wanted to mention, the most important theme in the matter of, can the dead actually hear us? So let's bring life in the ummah before we jump into, trying to figure out whether the dead can hear us or not. Let's just make sure we don't kill the ummah before we even come into the discussion whether the dead can hear us or not. If we're alive, then let's keep the ummah alive before we rush in discussing something that we will never whatsoever come to a final conclusion into or for, because it's all part of the unseen. No one came back to life and said,